They knew they were witnessing an historic moment of human achievement, broadcast live from the surface of the moon. The world celebrated as the astronauts took their first steps on the moon. But few people were even aware just how huge an effort it had taken to get them there. These Apollo 11 astronauts were just two of nearly 400,000 people who had worked over 10 years towards this goal. But how did they do it? What did it take to put humans on the moon? Our story starts in the 1950s, when rival superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, begin competing to build the best spacecraft. The Soviets achieved the first triumph when they put the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. 1 month later, they launched a second satellite, this time with a living passenger, a dog named Laika. Working hard to catch up, the Americans launched their first satellite, Explorer 1, the following year. Within 3 years, they had advanced their technologies enough to successfully launch and return Ham the Chimp. But then the Soviets achieved another major triumph. They successfully launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human to orbit the Earth. Less than a month later, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His successful flight gave America confidence in its space program.
I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
Before we find out how NASA planned to get to the moon, we need to cover the basics. First, distance. The moon is about 400,000 kilometers from Earth, so far that all the other planets in the solar system could fit between us. It is in constant motion, completing an orbit of Earth in just over 27 days. On the moon, there is no air to breathe, and the sunlit surface gets very hot, up to 127 degrees Celsius. But it gets cold in the shadows, dropping to minus 173 degrees. So, how did NASA plan to get people to cross this great distance and survive such extreme conditions? The plan was to break the journey into stages. The first of those was getting off the ground. For this, they designed the mighty Saturn V. 3 stacked rockets made it the most powerful launch system ever. Rather than land the whole spacecraft on the moon, NASA built a small landing craft, which was latched on for the ride. This would be the astronauts' home on the surface and return them to the main craft. Next, they had to consider the length of the journey. NASA calculated that it would take about 4 days to reach the moon. The craft had to be able to carry all the food, water, air, and fuel the 3 astronauts needed to reach the moon. And for their 4-day journey back, 2 astronauts would descend in the lunar module, leaving 1 in orbit. But to walk on the moon, they would need spacesuits. These would need to protect the astronauts and be flexible enough to move easily. Finally, they'd need to get home. The tiny craft that would land in the sea was just a small part of the tip of the giant Saturn V. This great project was called Apollo. Once they had a plan, NASA began to select astronauts by recruiting the best test pilots. The first group and their families moved to Houston to begin training in 1963. NASA recruited the best scientists, engineers, and mathematicians to design the components of the mission. They also called in support from specialist companies and universities around the country. This meant that the astronauts had to travel all over the United States. One day they would be in Virginia, training to land on the moon. The next, they would be in the Los Angeles harbor, training with the Navy for their return to Earth. Days later, they would be in Houston, practicing to set up experiments in their spacesuits. Then they would be sent to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. From here, they would be launched into space to test the new systems and spacecraft. In orbit, they also learned how to perform spacewalks. As their spacecraft orbited the Earth, radio telescopes around the world enabled constant communication with the astronauts. This international communication network made it possible to run the moon missions from a single building in Houston, Texas. Mission Control. Due to the complexity of the spacecraft, the astronauts were supported 24 hours a day by teams of scientists, engineers, and doctors. By watching the data displayed at these desks, they were able to help the astronauts control the spacecraft. Everything was monitored here, from the position and speed of the craft to the astronauts' health. All the teams constantly updated flight control, the person in charge of the room, and keeping the mission going according to plan. But only one person was allowed to talk to the crew. That was Capcom, the capsule communicator. The astronauts preferred to talk to one of their own, so Capcom was usually a trained astronaut too. While the astronauts were busy training and testing the craft that would carry them to the moon, someone needed to figure out the spacecraft trajectories required to get them there. In space, travel is complicated, as everything is in motion. The moon itself is moving at over 3,500 kilometers an hour. So, to calculate the speeds, mass, and forces the spacecraft needed, NASA needed exceptional people, like Katherine Johnson. She led a group of mathematicians to get a spacecraft to the moon, using no more than pencils, equations, and their brilliant minds. In the early days, the mathematicians themselves were called computers, but as the new electronic computers became more reliable, many of these women became programmers, creating new software for spaceflight. It was Margaret Hamilton's team that wrote the computer software that would allow the Apollo astronauts to get to and land on the moon. Kennedy's declaration to be the first to land on the moon and achieve it by the end of the decade put enormous pressure on everyone involved in the Apollo program. As a result, an early Apollo spacecraft was hurriedly assembled and delivered, untested. On the 27th of January 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White were conducting a flight rehearsal. Throughout the exercise, there were problems, as communication links between mission control and the capsule systems kept failing. Gus Grissom exclaimed, as part of the rehearsal, the capsule was pressurized by filling it with 100% oxygen. Then, perhaps due to a spark from a faulty wire, the oxygen-rich atmosphere ignited. The inward opening hatch made rescue impossible. Tragically, all 3 astronauts died in the fire. Their loss had a huge impact on the program. As a result, every procedure, system, and wire was reviewed, so that an accident like this could never happen again. But the Apollo program kept going, now more careful and dedicated to crew safety. They continued to improve the rockets and spacecraft, but without astronauts on board. Apollo 4 marked a major success, with all the Saturn V rocket stages working together for the first time. This was improved upon with Apollo 5 and 6. Apollo 7 had the first crewed flight, testing the craft in low Earth orbit for almost 11 days in space. Apollo 8 was a breakthrough in spaceflight. It was the first time humans left the Earth, orbited the Moon, and returned. On Apollo 9, all 3 modules worked together for the first time. Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal and return to the Moon. Every stage had been accomplished. It was time to attempt the last goal, to walk on the Moon. 14th of July, 1969, at Kennedy Space Center, Florida. On the launch pad was the biggest rocket ever built. Standing 111 meters tall and weighing almost 3,000 tons, this is the Saturn V. Inside the top, in a tiny metal capsule, are the astronauts of Apollo 11. Their names are Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They will make the first attempt to land on the moon. After 3 days in space, the Apollo 11 astronauts began preparing to slow down and put the craft in orbit around the moon. Unfortunately, this maneuver had to be carried out on the far side of the moon, away from radio contact. A mistake at this time might send them crashing into the moon, or worse, speeding off into deep space with no hope of return. The astronauts were on their own. There was nothing Mission Control could do but wait. The calculations were perfect to the second. Apollo 11 was now safely in orbit around the moon. It was now time. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin entered the lunar lander, ready to attempt the first ever moon landing. As they detach, Michael Collins is left alone in the main spacecraft. He knows there is a high likelihood that he will be making the return journey to Earth alone. There are 3 possible outcomes to their attempt. They will land, they will abort, or they will crash. Back in Mission Control, Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team monitor the progress of the landing craft.
Roger.
alarm sounds. Something is wrong with the computer. Mission Control must quickly decide whether to abort the mission. They choose to continue. Armstrong realizes that they are going to miss the planned landing site and are heading for a boulder field. He takes over control from the landing computer. All those hours of training come into play. Armstrong tries to find a flat landing site, but the lander is running out of fuel. When the clock gets to 0, they'll have to abort. They had done it. Every single person in the Apollo program had contributed to this moment. Together, they had put humans on the moon, and they had got there first. Back on Earth, 500 million people watched Neil Armstrong descend the ladder and become the first human to walk on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Minutes later, there's also joy to the whole The two moonwalkers had little time to enjoy the scenery. For the next 2.5 hours, they took photographs, set out experiments, and collected different types of rock and soil to bring home. Apollo 11 revolutionized our relationship with space. We had now proved that we could go beyond Earth. We had taken our first steps to exploring the cosmos. When the 3 astronauts returned, they were celebrated by a changed world. They returned to Earth as heroes. For many, this is where the story ends. But the Apollo 11 landing was only the first step in the human exploration of space. With renewed confidence in their spacecraft, NASA set out to explore other areas of the moon. But first they needed to improve their accuracy. Apollo 11 had missed its landing site by 6 kilometers. Only 4 months later, Apollo 12 successfully landed just 200 meters from its target, near an earlier spacecraft called Surveyor 3. They collected samples and set up science stations. These continued to transmit data long after the crew returned to Earth. Apollo 13 was unable to attempt a moon landing.